My name is Sheila Corona. Welcome to Sassy Seer Sheila and New Light Streaming Love, as this will be seen on both channels. This is Black Beauty by Jason Gray. The original transmission date of this writing, June 1st, 2026, so just yesterday. Before I tell you about my mother, I need to tell you what little I know about the people who came before her. Like so many family histories, mine is filled with gaps, silences, and questions that seem to have been buried long before I was born. My mother is of Icelandic descent. Her family came to Canada from Iceland in the late 19th century and eventually homesteaded around Churchbridge, Saskatchewan. They were among the pioneers who carved lives out of the unforgiving prairie landscape, building lives from determination, hard work, and hope. I know that my great-grandfather became involved in politics and participated in movements whose influence can still be felt today. Well, Jason, isn't that another interesting synchronicity between yourself and myself? I'm related to Harry S. Truman. My mother's maiden name was Truman, and he was her grandfather's cousin. Interesting that. And his influence can really still be felt today. Beyond that, much of the story becomes difficult to trace. Then there is my grandfather, my mother's father, the man I never met. From everything I have heard, he was an extremely brutal alcoholic. He died before I was born, leaving behind fragments, whispers, and unanswered questions. I also know he worked for the Canadian federal government, though every attempt I have ever made to learn more about him has ended the same way. Questions are met with silence. Conversations change direction. Doors close. The deeper I dig, the less I seem to find. What I do know is that whatever happened in that household left scars. Scars that found their way into the next generation and eventually into mine. Today, my mother is in her mid-70s. I am 51. Time has a strange way of changing perspective. After decades of carrying anger, confusion, hatred, and hurt, I have somehow managed to find forgiveness for her. Not because I excuse what happened, not because I deny it, not because I have forgotten, but because I've come to understand that people are often shaped by forces that existed long before they became parents themselves. Some wounds are inherited. Some pain is passed forward, and sometimes people spend their entire lives acting out injuries they never healed. And I'd like to say this about that myself. I have come to feel that trauma outlives and becomes embedded in the DNA. What is unresolved does move forward to the next generation. If that trauma and the shadows that it creates can be resolved within one lifetime. It does not pass to the next. That is my feel on the situation. I could be completely wrong. I just don't think so. There's an awful lot that I have experienced in my 64 years, and I have to say that I know that I carried an awful lot of my mother's unresolved trauma because it didn't make any sense otherwise. Because I had not been, to my knowledge, traumatized in that particular way. Anyway, back to the writing. I do not know exactly what happened to my mother as a child. I know only fragments, but I suspect whatever happened left marks deeper than anyone was willing to discuss. Understanding that has given me compassion. It has simply changed. No, sorry, it has not changed what happened. It has simply changed what I carry. The reality is that I grew up in a home where love was never visible. Feel you there, honey. I do not remember affection between my parents. I do not remember tenderness. I do not remember warmth. I do not remember hugs. I do not remember kisses. I do not remember encouragement. I do not remember comfort. What I remember is tension. What I remember is tension, conflict, silence, terror, a house that always seemed to be waiting for the next storm. As a child, I assumed this was normal. Children have no frame of reference. We believe every home operates the way our own does. Only later do we discover that what felt ordinary was anything but. My mother's anger dominated much of our home. The verbal abuse was relentless. The names she called me are names no child should ever hear from a parent. Some of those words followed me for decades, long after childhood ended, long after I left home. The physical abuse was equally common. Fear became part of my daily life. Not an exception, not an occasional event, a constant possibility. The kind of fear that teaches a child to study every tone of voice, every facial expression, every footstep in the hallway. I feel you there too, honey. Another synchronicity I just knew. I became an expert at reading emotional weather because survival required it. What complicated matters even further was witnessing similar abuse directed toward my father. As a young boy, I watched confrontations no child should have to witness. I watched him become the target of the same anger that was directed at me. For many years, I viewed him simply as absent. The man who was always working, the man who was rarely home, the man who never stopped what was happening, but age has complicated that picture. Today, when I look back, I sometimes wonder if he was afraid too. There were moments when he did not look like a man in control. There were moments when he looked like a man trying to survive. As a child, I did not have the language to describe any of this, but I remember it, and when I search for words to describe how my mother appeared to me during those years, I struggle. Not because there are too many words, but because there are too few. The words that come to mind are uncomfortable, yet they are honest to the experience of the child I once was. As a boy, she seemed evil to me, not occasionally angry, not merely strict, evil. The rage felt endless. The cruelty often felt deliberate. The verbal attacks could be relentless. The physical punishments could arrive suddenly and without mercy. There were times when I genuinely believed she was possessed by something dark. Not because I understood theology, not because I had evidence, but because I could not comprehend how a person could transform so completely. You see that I I married a man very similar to that myself. And honey, there was more than likely something riding shotgun. I look at us as open portals. And rage is one of those kinds of things. Anger uh, allows for that to ride shotgun. And in my opinion, that's just my perspective. I watched it. I watched my second husband's eyes change right before my eyes and become a different color altogether. One moment she could be one person, the next, someone entirely different. Oh, yes, same, same, same. As a child, that contradiction was impossible to reconcile. Today, I see something different. I see a damaged woman, a wounded woman, a woman carrying burdens I will likely never fully understand. But I also refuse to deny what that child experienced because both things can be true. Absolutely correct, sir. They're not can be, they are true. A person can deserve compassion and still cause enormous harm. A person can be forgiven and still leave scars that last a lifetime. There is another, well, and I'll go you one better. I never didn't love my husband, not once. I loved him always, right through all the abuse. And to this day, even though I refused to live with him, and I got myself out of that situation, mostly because I had a child to protect, but still, at least there was that much clarity within me. And to this day, I still care deeply for him. It's just that no one deserves to be treated like that. So it is possible to continue to love someone, from my perspective again. A person can be forgiven and still leave scars that last a lifetime. There is another realization that arrived only recently. I do not remember ever being told that I was loved. I understand and I feel you. Not by my mother, not me either. Not by my father, mine wasn't present, so yep, same. 51 years is a long time to carry the absence of a memory. I remember punishments, I remember fear, I remember beatings, I remember arguments, I remember the names I was called, but I cannot remember hearing the words, I love you. Perhaps they were spoken once and I forgot. Perhaps they were implied, or perhaps they were never spoken at all. They were not. I have relentlessly searched my memory, and those words are nowhere to be found. My father was largely absent during my childhood, not because he abandoned us, because he was working, always working, providing, trying to support a family. Much of my memory of him consists of arrivals and departures, headlights in the driveway, a suitcase, a weekend, then gone again. One of the few periods when he was home more consistently was around the time my younger brother Derek was born, on January 26, 1980, in Melfort, Saskatchewan, and after he got sick. That brings me to something I have only recently noticed. My memories before Derek's birth are completely gone. Not faded, not blurry, gone. Entire chapters have completely vanished. I know they existed. I know I lived them. Yet when I reach backward into that period of my life, I encounter only darkness. You know, I have the same kind of experience, and I have a theory about that. Maybe you and I will talk about it sometime. A fog so thick it feels impenetrable. For years, I never questioned it. Now I do. Why that period? Why those years? I do not know. Perhaps there are extraordinary explanations. Perhaps those memories simply faded. Perhaps they will return. What I do know is there is a doorway there, and when I approach it, I find only shadows. What I also remember is that my brother and I were not treated equally. Children notice these things. They notice where affection flows. They notice where patience exists. They notice who receives understanding and who receives criticism. I cannot point to a single moment when I consciously realized it. I simply knew. When it came to my mother, I was not the preferred child, not even close. That realization is not written with bitterness, not anymore. It is simply the truth as I experienced it. Children rarely blame their parents, they blame themselves. They conclude there must be something wrong with them. Those conclusions have a way of following people into adulthood. There is another memory that keeps returning as I write, one that feels important. Not because it explains my mother, but because it may explain me. As a young boy, I would climb onto my bicycle and ride to church by myself. My parents did not attend church, yet church became important to me. At the time, I genuinely believed God lived there. I believed if I wanted to be close to God, I needed to go where He was, and so I rode alone. A small boy on a bicycle making his way toward a building he believed housed the greatest love in the universe. Looking back now, I find something both beautiful and heartbreaking in that image, because I loved God with every fiber of my being. And yet another synchronicity. While I didn't ride a bike on my own to church, I gathered up my brother and sister and caught the little Sunday school bus because my mother wasn't taking us and I really wanted to go. Wow. Not because I understood religion, but because I was searching for something even way back then. Safety, acceptance, comfort, love. Something inside me believed that if I could just get close enough to God, I would find whatever it was I was missing. And then there is Black Beauty. Of all the memories I have of my mother, this is the one that refuses to disappear. I do not remember the room. I do not remember the season. I do not remember exactly how old I was, but I remember the book, and I remember her reading it to me. For reasons I could never explain, I loved that story. I would ask her to read it again and again, and somehow, when she did, everything changed, at least for a little while. The rage disappeared, the criticism stopped, the verbal attacks ceased, the tension that permanently occupied our home would temporarily lift. The woman who spent so much of my childhood angry became someone else. Not forever, not even for very long, but for long enough. Long enough for me to notice. Long enough for me to remember 50 years later. As I sit here writing these words, I find myself wondering if that is why I asked so often. Perhaps I had discovered one of the few doorways into a version of my mother that felt safe, a version of her that was not angry, a version of her that was not looking for reasons to punish, a version of her that seemed, if only briefly, at peace. Maybe Black Beauty became my shelter. Maybe I was not just asking for a story. Maybe I was asking for an hour without fear. Maybe I was asking for a mother. The strange thing is that I cannot remember most of what she read. What I remember is the feeling. I remember her voice. I remember the atmosphere changing. I remember the house becoming quiet. I remember the war pausing. Looking back now, I no longer see Black Beauty as merely a book. I see it as a doorway, a temporary bridge between a frightened little boy and the mother he wished he had. For a few pages at a time, she became that mother. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough for the memory to survive everything that came after. Enough for a 51-year-old man to still remember her voice. Enough for me to realize that the memory I carried was never really about Black Beauty at all. It was about hope. The hope that the mother reading the book was the real mother. The hope that tomorrow might be different. The hope that she might stay, the hope that love was still hiding somewhere beneath the anger. Perhaps that is why becoming a father mattered so much to me, because I knew exactly what I never wanted my boys to question. Another synchronicity, sir. I wanted my boys so badly. I never wanted them to wonder if they were loved, so I told them every day, over and over. I told them I loved them. I told them how important they were. I told them how proud I was of them. I told them they mattered. I told them they were loved every single day. If there is one thing I am grateful for, it is that my boys never had to wonder. They heard the words. They knew, and perhaps every time I told them, a small part of the little boy I once was heard them too. One of the greatest privileges of my life was kneeling beside my sons at bedtime. 3 little boys, 3 growing minds, 3 souls entrusted to my care. I got to stop there for a second because that's another synchronicity we have. About 7 years ago, a psychic told me that I had a son, which I do. And she couldn't have known, oh, wait a minute, this has been 11 years ago, 10 or 11 years ago, actually. She couldn't have known because she didn't even have my last name, much less the fact that his last name is not my last name. And she told me he chose me because he knew that I would love him unconditionally. Oh, that's the truth. And it seems to me like your boys chose you for that very same reason, probably because of the way we were raised. Because we had the capacity. We didn't want our children to doubt our love. And this is what I mean by saying the things we go through, we have no idea what they affect or are meant to do for us. Wow. 3 little souls entrusted to my care. I would get down on my knees with them and teach them something that had somehow survived from my own childhood, a simple prayer. Together we would fold our hands and begin. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. The little boy who rode his bicycle to church because he believed God lived there eventually became a father, kneeling beside his own children, teaching them how to pray. Somewhere between those 2 moments, a circle was completed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough for love to be spoken aloud. Enough for my boys to hear the words I never remember hearing. Enough for them to know they were loved before they closed their eyes each night. And now, as I write these words, I have this strange feeling that yet another door has begun to open. A door that has also remained closed for decades. I did not expect to write about my mother. I certainly did not expect this many memories to emerge. Yet, memory seems to have its own agenda. One recollection leads to another. One question unlocks 10 more. One fragment reveals an entire hidden hallway. I do not know what waits inside. I do not know what memories will return. I do not know what truths remain buried. I do not know what I will discover about my mother, or my father, or myself. All I know is that this door is now open, and after 51 years, I am finally beginning to walk through it. Jason Gray. Well, I salute you for having the bravery to go ahead and walk through that door, sir. Many don't get that opportunity. I have not, as of yet, had that opportunity myself. And I don't know that I ever will. There's a part of me that feels that it may not be necessary, but I don't know. I'm open and always willing. As with all of Jason's work, there will be a link in the Show More section underneath this video where you can go and find his work freely available. However, he does ask for subscriptions if you care to support him. And I hope that you will move towards that which draws your attention, because there is definitely something there for you. Something perhaps you're leading yourself to for discovery, just like Jason, just like myself. Until we meet again, be well, my friends.